so with the remaining of this paper, my practice, so using your practice paper, we're going to just practice a few floral brush strokes. And then we don't want to waste any time. And then we're going to get straight into our painting because we have to build it up, right? So what we're going to do is just practice, like I said, a few color mixings, a few brush strokes. I think it's very helpful if you do have it, have your color sheet like in front of you. That way you can see like what I'm saying as far as color mixing. So I'm going to start with rose, which is the pink. Just load my brush up. And we want to practice a few brush strokes. If you've taken my class before, then you probably practiced these strokes before. But this is just good practice, maybe with a different brush and just to practice the stroke. So you want to do point, create these little points, just so you can get a feel with like how light you can touch your brush to the paper. Little, okay, to give you a feel. If you've never held a paintbrush before, just make sure that you hold it like you would pencil. You have the most control towards the tip of the brush. If you hold it too far out, then it's going to be a little looser and you won't feel like that control. Okay, so point, press, pull, lift. Point, press, pull, lift. Let's do that a few times. Point, press, pull, lift. So I wanted to show you kind of how you can end up with different strokes by doing the same kind of exercise. So just depending on how hard you push down. So your brush can get an okay width, okay? The harder you press down, the wider the brush stroke will be. But you want to start with like a tip more, or like just a little bit of less pressure towards the top to get that leaf or petal shape. And then as you're pulling, you press down and then you slowly lift up when you want to end the brush stroke. So it's rare when I just want to do one straight up and down brush stroke, okay? That's why we're going to learn how to do like more curved ones or combine two together. And that's what I do a lot of the times with these flowers is I combine two petals to create one, to create like a nice curve. Okay. So to get started, let's try that one more time. Point, press, so press down, pull, lift. You'll notice there might be some more color that stays towards the tip of your brush or tip of your stroke. And that's okay because what happens is that we're going slower, so it's going to accumulate towards the bottom. But you know what? Like normally when you're creating things, you're going to have shadow more towards the bottom of a brush stroke. So it kind of does the work for you in that way as well. So you're creating your own shadow, but just so you know, it's doing that. It's like pulling at the bottom because we are going slower in our practice. And as you get better, you're going to go quicker with the movements and that pull will not be as obvious. So you want to learn how to like curve too to create one brush stroke. So you start at the top and I'm going to go off to my right first and then my left. Using more of the side of the brush, I'm going to curve it off to the right and then slowly pull it back in and lift. So that's like a simple curve. And if I wanted to do it on the other side, point, press, kind of using more of this side of my brush and then lifting like that. Okay, and then what you would do is like combine these two, like combine them, and then we create like one petal. So point, press, pull, and then I kind of lay right on top of it to create one wider petal. So let's practice that a few times. And let's practice that. Like, I'm going to show you doing it like several times and how you end up with like a slightly different shape. So if I pull it a little bit longer and leaving maybe a little bit of gap, and that gives it a little highlight if you want in your flower. Sometimes you want more texture. So for example, I would do like one side like this, and then I'd come in with a skinnier one and leave a little gap at the top to give it some texture. Okay. It's like the variety of ways to create these. There's so many, but it's just like you start with this basic shape and kind of manipulate it to create the variations. So if you're having trouble creating the curves, what I suggest is you just do like a little line of just doing your little curves on one side and then practice it on the other side as well. What you'll notice, and you'll even notice, because being left-handed, I have a harder time creating curves on my left side. And that's normal because of like the way your hand is going to be placed. So if you're right-handed, you'll probably have a harder time creating nice curves on your right side. So what I do is normally what happens is if I can't get the shape that I want, like for example, this kind of has a little bit more of an elbow that I don't like. While it's still wet, I go back in and I just kind of fix the shape how I want it a little bit. And that's fine. That's just knowing how to fix something when there's a little bit of a discrepancy between like one and the, like one of them and the one that you like and the one that you don't like. So if you go in and you add like adjustments while it's still wet, that's perfectly fine. So it's not a one and done deal. If you put down a mark and you're like, uh-oh, just do it while it's still wet, because that will make a huge difference. Like as far as just not seeing that other line that you add or marking, it'll blend in right into the shape if it's still wet. Okay. Okay, so let's practice creating a few florals, just doing these techniques. So I work with like an invisible open circle, and some people can, do that, and some people have a hard time with it. So if you have a hard time just working out of an open, like from an open circle, or like in basically an invisible circle, you can actually create a very thin circle form like that and like work your way around it. What I do suggest though is like as you get better at it, you eliminate that circle because it makes it look less free flowing and like whimsical because it has too much structure, right? But for the sake of learning, this is very important if you need it. So don't be like if I feel like if don't deny putting it there if you need to learn how to do it and get successful at it. Just eliminate it once you feel more secure like with how you're creating it without it. And what I mean by that is for example, so we have this circle, right? So let's start with that. And we create 2 combined petals, right, to create one. And it's really loose. So we just kind of go around like I create 5 to 6 petals for each flower normally. Right? And they're all going to be different depending on how they're configured into the composition. You'll see in the sample that so we have like one that's more full and open, right? And then this one's kind of hiding underneath, but still pretty exposed. And then this one is going to be like a half of one coming out. So it's good to like create layerings like that as well. But just keep in mind that these brush strokes are going to be quick because like we have to fill a space, and also like so that way like take away again that idea of creating like this perfect flower, because honestly the imperfections in these flowers are going to make your composition more actually beautiful to look at, to be honest. So that's why I really love doing it as like a beginner or people who are practicing, because I feel like it's a good practice for them to kind of stay, like, kind of get away from that, like trying to do something just very perfect. And I know that's hard. That can be very hard. Okay. So I want to show you what I mean by doing one without the circle. So I'm working around. I'm going to make this a little darker so you can see it better. I leave gaps sometimes between petals just for definition if I feel like there's too many overlapping or there's not enough definition between some of them so they don't turn into like a blob. So keep that in mind as well. Okay, so notice the difference, say, between like this one and this one, right? This one looks way more structured because it has that circle that we put. This one is less because we just worked around an invisible circle. What I want you guys to do during this piece is, if you are having a hard time, I suggest, like, because we are still, you know, practicing and learning, I would say try to do at least half of the flowers without the circle if you can. And then the other half, if you need to go back to the circle, then use that. But that way you can really practice, because this is really for you to practice and learn how to create, you know, more of a whimsical floral. So really, because we're creating so many of them, give yourself some practice by doing at least half of these without that drawn in circle. You'll also notice when creating the flower that you'll start at different starting points as you work your way around. That's one thing I think is important to mention. So when I'm working towards the top petal, I work from out to in. And basically I work from out to in on like the top side like this, right? And then as I make my way down and around, I work from in to out. And that's how I do it and how it's comfortable for me. If you find that like doing it the opposite way works better for you, then do that. The whole point is for you to create a flower without having to turn your paper, you know, in a circle. So just keep that in mind, that you will have to change where the starting point is when you're creating your petals as you work your way around the flower. So it either will be from out to in towards the center, or in to out towards like the end of your petal. Creating one more, I want to just show you what that looks like, adding like another layer of color for like contrast, because you'll notice how in the painting I added like a ring around the center. What I'm going to do is go into I'm just going to call it deep yellow, because I don't know if I'm saying the word right, gamboge or whatever. So let's say deep yellow and cat yellow. Those are the different ones that I'm going to refer to. So we're going to go into our deep yellow, and here's one thing to think about also when we're creating layers. When we're working wet into wet, so this layer is already wet here, right? If we're adding in another layer of color, we want the second layer of color to be a little less watered down. So you don't need it to be pooled. So I'm really, if you're looking off to the left here, really taking it, having a little water, and then I'm going to add it towards the inner circle and pull it out. And notice just what a difference that makes. Like, gives it such a nice whimsical contrast. Because I didn't add a ton of water to my yellow when I added it to my pink, I had more control of where that yellow would go. If your pink is super dry, it would have just sat on top. It probably didn't move. So that's another thing to consider when we're building these flowers. We're going to basically have to create the base, which is the pink part, and then layer in the shadow or contrast, which would be like the yellow or whatever color we choose. That way the pink doesn't dry. and it actually creates a bleed when we put the yellow on it, okay? And then, but say you notice that, here, I'll show you. Say you notice that you create like a pink flower, or it's really light, hold on. And like, just even think, look how like loose that I'm painting, right? I just want you to see like a contrast of what I'm trying to show you. So I have to just make it a little deeper for the camera. Okay. So say you have this, it's pretty wet. You go in with some yellow. Okay. And I added in like that, right? Well, I added a lot more water to my yellow. So it's really bleeding out and it's going to blend into that pink, and you're still going to see it, but just notice how it's like more blurred, right? This is kind of has a more, even though it's not defined, it is in a way, like you can still see the separation, like it's still different than the pink to the yellow, but it still blends really well. But with this one, it was so wet going onto a wet surface that it's like bleeding right into the pink and combining with it. And we're going to be left with probably like just like really one color. Okay, so moving on to our next flower. It's going to be our ultramarine blue. So ultramarine blue, and I'm going to mix it in with some white. And I'm also going to use, for more contrast at certain places, I'll add in more of the blue to get it a little deeper. But I'm going to grab a little white over here, create a little pile, add a little blue. And this is like my favorite, like, you know, cornflower blue. I love this color. If you follow along with me on my Instagram or anything, you'll know this is one of my favorite colors. I want to show you this next flower is kind of like a side bloom or like a very loose type of tulip. So we really just, it's like 3 markings really. So you start with the center like this, and then you create one kind of wrapping around, leaving a small gap, and like that. So this is really the main like form of this bloom, but we're gonna like do it looser and, you know, using different thinner marks here and there. So for example, I'm gonna do the same thing, but like maybe go up higher on one side, or I do a skinnier one on one side and I just leave it like with 2 like that. Or I do one and like with 2 thin ones on the side like that. But notice how I'm always keeping a little texture, so leaving a little bit of space between it and the one next to it, just towards the top, right? And like this one's a little farther down or whatever, but you're basically curving it in or tapering it in to create more of that bloom shape. What you want to avoid is just doing something like this, where it's straight up and down, right? You're really just pulling it into the center like that. So there's not much to say about this one. It's very loose like this. And what I'll go in is I'll mix a little more blue and we'll get like a darker one like this, because I like to have a contrast of like lights and darks. As you'll see in the sample, like we'll have a little bit of more blue showing, a little lighter throughout as we're layering. And you'll notice like some of them are bigger and some of them are teenier. So we'll have some smaller blooms. This one, again, is very forgiving, a few marks. But the main thing to remember about this one is the curves or the roundness. The tapering gets thinner at the bottom and leaving a tiny bit of space between your brush strokes towards the top to create that texture. Because if you don't do that, you're going to just basically create something like that. Which that means like, okay, my bloom is completely closed, which is fine if you do that for a few, but I want you to do it not for all of them. Okay. And then I actually added a little bit of my cad yellow to the bottom while it's still wet, like that, but not super wet. So if you find that the bottom is super wet, you want to wait to add it. So what I usually did was I do like maybe 6 or 7 of them, And then I'd go in and I'd add this little bit of yellow towards the bottom. And it's really creating kind of like a little tent, upside down triangle, like that. And what that does is, I did it with and without the yellow, and the yellow just added so much more to the piece. And I just like love that contrast of yellow and blue and how it just made that flower pop more. So even adding these subtle, colors into your piece in the smallest places really makes a big difference between your painting. And so I just suggest when you're always creating something, try something on the side to see if you like it, because just adding a little bit, of extra color here and there can make such a difference. It's just an added detail, Okay. So while we have these, let's create our little stems for them. So for this one, I used a mixture of the two greens, but I used a lot of the light green, and then I would go into some of them and add the dark green for contrast so that, it looked like it wasn't just straight one color. So I'll show you. And I'll kind of get into that more as we're creating it so you get the better idea. But use one of the ones that you created. So then I would create my stem, like a thin kind of slight curve. I always like slight curves in my stems, whether it's to the left or the right. If you have a hard straight line in your painting, especially something with a flower field like this, your eye can go straight to that line. It just does. It's just this because you have so many organic factors, so many curves, if you have one straight line, your eye will go there. That's what I've noticed. So just always a slight curve. And it's different if you're creating, say, one sunflower stalk and that's your painting. That's different because it's your eye, you're looking at one thing, right? But because there's so many things in this painting, that's why I'm saying adding a slight curve to things will keep your eye from going to one spot because you want it to go to the full painting. Okay, so once you have the stem, we're just going to do our point, press, pull, lift, like our leaf, like we practiced at the top, like this as our leaves, right? And I don't necessarily line them up. It's really random. So depending on where the space is and how I need to fill it will determine how many leaves that I add. But I just want you guys to kind of practice, kind of going in. And notice how as I get closer to the stem, some of them, it gets thinner. And then some of them hug more, overlap it. What you want to avoid is just something like that, where you're just creating like this. You need some width to your leaf. So make sure you use the tip. So point, press, and then lift. Okay. Again, having the smaller brush hopefully will help you, with that control. So here's an example if I wanted to go in and add some contrast to some of them. So I would do my green, and then I would go in with my deep green, and I kind of just go over sections, right? And say I added another leaf that was of that color over it. And I always like to do this while, again, the first green layer still has some wet factor to it. That way that darker green kind of blends into it nicely. Okay. So we're going to go and add in these darker greens throughout as we're creating. And for some of this flower in specific, I add some smaller lines using the tip of my brush, kind of curve down to create smaller leaves hugging the head of the flower. And that's not on all of them, but that's just on some of them that you'll notice. Something like that. So really just using the tip, creating kind of an arch. So practice both sides, like an eyebrow. If you're creating eyebrows on a face, it's like that. And like I said, these are loose, they're forgiving, but you do want them to be pretty thin so that they don't overpower. The whole point is to add a little bit of extra detail to the flower. Okay. So the last thing I want to show you before we start is our sweet pea light or flower. Okay. So we're going to be mixing our purple. So what I do is I take a little white and then I grab a little bit of this purple. It's very powerful. So you really need a little purple compared to the white. Then I add more water just to really water it down to get like a nice, like lighter purple color. And then what I'm going to do is grab some pink and I'm going to just put it off to the side here because I'm going to be adding pink as well as another like contrasting color, but I want it prepped. So I'm just going to pull some pink over here so it's ready to go. Okay, so kind of wash out my brush a little to get that pink out. So I'll start with the stem. So I'm going to use the light green. I'm going to water it down just to get like a lighter color. So like notice how light that is, right? Then rinse my brush off just a little. Just make sure the green's out. And then we're going to start with our purple. So make sure that it's, nice and watered down. Get it in your brush. I like to, let's start at the top for this one. And I create like a really rough outline to create the texture. And I create some like bumps at the top, like that. Okay. And then I do one kind of coming off the side, again, with some texture at the top. And then I taper it off, or like I stagger it, I mean. So it's not like in line with this other one. And I create one more kind of shape like that. I go back to my water with my brush and I fill it just with the paint that I have created with that outline and pull that paint towards the center. Okay. I really want to make sure that I get rid of the outline and fill it nicely. So look how, like that's like very light purple, right? And then I go in with a little more purple. So I go back into my purple. So this one's more whimsical, right? So it's like just like a lot more layers like of color. So, but you have to start lighter. Okay. While these are still wet, I go in with a little purple towards the base and kind of pull up the color and kind of let it go wherever. So I have that like lighter tip, but then that it's still a lighter purple, but relative to that first layer, it's creating a little depth. Then I'm going to grab some of that pink and just create another layer, fill it. And then I'm going to take that pink and add it in to the bottom of just a few of these. You can spread it around a little bit. And whatever color is in your brush right now, you can create like a back layer like that. Fill it in, but don't touch that purple first layer that you have at the top. Just get really close to it. You're basically creating a layer that's like receding. It's like behind, right? And depending on where your flower is, you will decide on how many layerings to create as far as like in the back or whatnot. But this is the gist of our little sweet pea here. And what I like to do is add a little bit of that deep green, but you got to make sure that it's not watered down. You really want it like straight from the palette because these are so wet. I add them towards the tips or the bottoms of the little petals, and then they'll kind of slowly bleed out. And I clean my brush out when I do that, after I do that, and I can kind of help that green move a little bit if I need to. I could pull it into the stem a little bit if my stem is like super light. Okay. But in order for that green to really stay in place, you got to make sure that it is almost straight from the palette, like less watered down. Otherwise, that green will go everywhere. And if that happened to you, get your paper towel, lift it out, reapply the pink or purple that you need, and then go back in with that green, but really less watered down.